This week on the Life Well podcast.
It is well. I don't just think about death and loss. I think about shifts. I think about private funerals and quiet grief during the becoming phase of an entrepreneur, the becoming phase of a wife, the becoming phase of a mother, the becoming phase of a widow, and the kind of peace that that song talks about as it's coupled with the same kind of grief. So when grief shows up in your life, it doesn't mean that your faith is necessarily failing. It might actually mean that your heart is so capable of loving that you can't tell the difference between before and after. Welcome back to the Life Well podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Ann Young, and we are back with another episode about the intersection of your faith and your mental health. Last week, we took a journey down burnout lane, and I hope since then you've been able to get some rest, some relaxation as you carry all of those amazing gifts that the Lord has blessed you with. If last week was kind of about pressing through when you're tired, this week is about what you do when pressing through might not be the best idea. Grief is what we're talking about today, and it is often described as love with nowhere to go. People comfort others with words from ancient philosophers, apostles, pastors, even top Billboard artists. But how to navigate this painful reality that nothing good comes fast and everything good comes to an end is this idea that we have to wrestle with. Seasons end, chapters end, friendships end, and even lives end. It's in the fabric of humanity, and yet it feels like anything but natural. So, before we get into the full conversation today, I want to ask you a question. And we typically start off with a question anyway, so this is not unnatural for the Life Well podcast. Is there something that you haven't grieved? Not because it wasn't real and not because it didn't hurt, but you just felt like you weren't strong enough to do so. Let that question sit with you as we get into today's episode. We know that quotes about grief have circled both psychology and spirituality for centuries. From a psychological standpoint, grief isn't just an emotion, it's a full body event. If you've ever lost something or someone, you know what I'm talking about. It's like all the blood leaves your body for a split second, you gasp. Maybe you have enough air in your lungs to actually gasp before memories collide with reality, and then the cycle continues. Your amygdala fires, your nervous system feels like it's about to flood. The prefrontal cortex gets just a little bit foggy, and that's why you can't think straight, and your chest feels really heavy, and brushing your teeth feels like it takes way too much energy. Grief is the body's way of saying something I love, something I need is missing. My journey of studying grief and emotions goes all the way back to high school, but I didn't really start specifically studying grief itself until about 2023. And I'm not specifically trained in grief therapy, but with the populations that I find myself working with, the concept of grief and loss and longing continually show up. These are consistent themes, whether a person is grieving the death of a loved one or a move from a hometown or even a divorce or even professional rejection. The symptoms continue to sound so similar, so I hit the books, specifically the good book. People describe grief as love with nowhere to go, like we just said, but we already know that in psychology. Grief in its natural response to loss, we grieve relationships, we grieve expectations, we even grieve identities. And we have this overwhelming amount of evidence in the literature and in science about what grief means, and it's pretty similar to processing physical pain. And the largest takeaway from my deep dive on grief actually didn't come from any of those textbooks that I spend way too much money on in school. It comes from the Bible. And the most simple statement from what I learned is this: grief did not start with us, it started with God. In Genesis chapter 3, which I learned in Bible class is also known as the proto-evangelium, Adam and Eve hid after, they ate the fruit. The issue that we had with Eve is all based on that, right? So in Genesis chapter 3, they eat the fruit and God asks, "Where are you?" And when God calls out to Adam after the fall, he says one word in Hebrew, Ika. It's translated as "where are you?" But it's not this kind of location-based "where are you?" God isn't confused about where Adam is. The word carries relational weight. It's the kind of question you ask when someone you love feels distant and far away. And in many words, the first word is lament. In scripture, God is grieving this kind of separation between humanity and himself. What's interesting is that this word actually shows up later in the Bible in a place that is unmistakably about grief. In the book of Lamentations, it begins with the same word, Ica, but it starts with an E. Most English translations render that as how. It says, how lonely sits the city. But in Hebrew, Ica and Ica with the E share the same linguistic root, and they sound strikingly similar. Both words carry this tone of lament and bewilderment and sorrow over something that has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Jewish commentators have noted that this connection exists for centuries. In Genesis, God asks Micah, "Where are you?" And in Lamentations, the prophet says, "Micah, how did this happen?" And these two words frame the entire story of a broken relationship. One expresses God's grief over distance, and the other expresses human grief over the consequences of that same kind of distance. In Genesis, the relationship between God and humanity is fractured. And in Lamentations, we see what that fractured world eventually looks like. Cities are destroyed, people are exiled, and hearts are broken. So the Bible story of grief almost begins and echoes with the exact same sound, Ica with an A and Ica with an E. And anytime I've heard grief hit somebody in real time, it sounds just like that. Where are you? How did it come to this? Both are the language of love and lament, because you don't really ask questions like that. Where are you? How did this happen? Or your body just lets out a noise that sounds quite like Ica unless you have lost something that you really, really love. After learning all of these things and putting the science and the scripture together, I knew then I couldn't just do an episode on grief and talk about, the 7 stages and teach the viewers and call it a day. From there, I went on a deeper dive because I wanted to see how this shows up again. And the Bible never shies away from grief. David wept when his child died, and yet after his tears, he worshiped, showing us that grief and praise can coexist. And Hannah, she poured out her soul in the temple. She was so brokenhearted that people thought she was drunk, showing us that grief is often misunderstood by others, but it's never dismissed by God. And then Jesus, who knew he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, he still didn't get lost on the fact that sorrow had hit his heart and worry had hit his heart, and Jesus wept. Even resurrection power didn't stop him from kind of sitting with that ache of the moment. So if the Bible's great figures and even God wrapped in flesh himself grieved, then your grief is not a weakness, even when it feels like it, because we've learned for 2 seasons now, feelings are a gauge. They are not a guide. The 7 stages of grief, however, are a guide, and they're taught to normalize the experiences that one might have when they experience a loss. Many people have heard of these stages of grief, and they're not bad. I just didn't want to do an episode on them alone. Originally, Dr. Ross outlined 5, and later psychologists expanded it to 7. Those are the 7 that we know now. And they aren't just steps that you move through in a straight line. That's the most important piece. Grief is not linear, okay? You can float in and out of these stages at any given point in time. You can spin the block on a stage. It really isn't a linear process. And I think sometimes that's where the confusion or the discomfort with grief may come from. Grief honestly moves most like a wave. And when I have conversations with clients in therapy, or I'm learning about it in school or speaking to classmates, the best explanation or metaphor that I've ever heard of is to describe it like a wave. If you have a stream or a river that flows directly into an ocean, and then all of a sudden, without any kind of warning, somebody builds a wall right there, made out of concrete, nothing that you could knock down. That stream no longer has direct access into that ocean. That's what grief is. That's all that stream is, love. That ocean is the thing you love, the thing you were expecting, the person that you lost. That's that ocean. And when grief hits, you lose access immediately. And that water in that stream doesn't stop flowing. It starts to well up when there's too much, and it crashes back in the direction of the stream. And that's what grief feels like. Out of nowhere, It just wells up. And without a new place to flow, that love that has nowhere to go starts to make your body feels like it's overwhelmed. So this first stage that's described in the literature is shock and belief, that numb, this can't be real feeling. And in my example, I get that. Like, where did this wall come from? Who put this wall right here? What happened? Where are you? It's the same kind of question that's being asked in scripture. And then that second phase is denial. No way. You're avoiding the truth because it feels too heavy. And that's in any kind of grief. We describe the third stage as anger. And sometimes that could look as somebody is angry at themselves, somebody is angry at other people. You could be angry at God, which then naturally transitions into that fourth stage, which is bargaining, right? I'm trying to make deals to undo the loss. And sometimes it's unrealistic, but when our brain goes into shutdown mode because it's trying to reconcile with a wall that it's not supposed to see, logic is out the window. We're trying to bargain to make sure that we don't lose the thing that we love the most. And the fifth stage of grief, the original end point for grief, is the depressive thoughts, that deep sadness that kind of sets in, that loss of breath in our body or that confusion in our mind. As later psychologists continued to study grief, those next two stages were added. The sixth stage is testing, slowly experimenting with new ways forward. That stream now has a wall. That ocean is inaccessible. Where does this water now go? That thing that I once loved, that I shared with my grandmother, the lemon cake recipe that she had. Nobody in my family can make it like she did. I never learned how to make it like she did. How will I access that lemon cake? Stream, ocean, wall. Panera has a pretty good lemon cookie. I gotta be honest. And every time I go, I ask them if they have one of those in the back. They don't always put it out front. That's a little stream that love can flow into. That's a new place. That's what that sixth step is about. This kind of testing with then takes us into step number 7, which is the last one that we kind of look at when we're looking at grief from a psychological perspective, which is acceptance, which is honestly a word I don't like to use in grief therapy, because what do you mean you want me to accept this? That doesn't translate well to a heart that is broken. But when I say acceptance, I'm talking about learning to live with the loss instead of die with the loss, even if it still hurts. Living with the memory of your grandmother, living with the memory of the job you lost, living with the memory of the relationship that did not work out. How do I stay alive? How do I say I'll be okay and acknowledge that this thing is no longer accessible? You don't graduate from one stage to the next. Grief is more like a cycle than a checklist. But knowing these stages can help us name what we're feeling instead of just thinking we're crazy. So I think there's something powerful when someone can say, I know the science and I know the faith, but I also know the ache in my chest. I can feel it in my chest. This is the kind of topic that I think resonates with all listeners. You don't have to be interested in mental health, psychology, or the intersection of faith and all the things that I talk about to be able to resonate with losing someone. Whether you've lost a person, or you've lost a job, or you lost your identity, or you lost a baby. We have all lost something. But we know that this podcast is about the intersection, so let's get a little bit of science, okay? The researchers note that there are 5 different types of grief. So we go through those 7 stages, but oftentimes we only talk about it when it comes to funerals, right? But there is an anticipatory kind of grief. This is grief that comes before the loss, when you know a change is coming, like a diagnosis or watching a parent or a grandparent decline, or even that feeling when you know a relationship is coming to an end. My friends and I, as we age, we note the discomfort in that age because we realize not just, we're knocking on 30's door. I'm not banging on 30, okay? I'm knocking very lightly, but I know that I'm getting closer. So this anticipatory grief to my 20's is a very real thing, but we also realize that our parents and our grandparents are aging as well. So I also feel this kind of grief as I near the end of anything, including my undergraduate career. The second type of grief that's worth talking about is ambiguous grief. This is grief without closure or a type of recognition. This is like a friendship just kind of fading out, or a dream popping up in your head and then never really being realized, or a version of yourself that just kind of faded into the abyss. Ambiguous grief is tricky because it doesn't look like anything is obviously gone. It's the grief that shows up when you lose something that didn't necessarily die, but it also doesn't feel like it's here anymore. Culturally, it's when a friendship just kind of drifts apart, no big fight, right? Maybe somebody moved away. And when you realize the version of yourself from high school or college doesn't really fit into your current life, you can't hold a funeral for it, but you still feel that same kind of ache. That's ambiguous grief. So for me, that looks like I had a very important friendship and my life began to fade. And we had been friends since like the seventh grade, sixth grade, and all throughout college. And then one day I woke up and we just weren't talking anymore. And we had built so much life together in that friendship. And it ended up being a season that didn't unfold the way that I imagined, but it wasn't as drastic as like an anticipatory grief or the kind of grief that strikes you when someone passes away. The fire on the friendship went out, regardless of any attempt I or she made to fan the flame. A third type of grief is complicated or prolonged grief. And this is when grief feels stuck. This is usually the kind of grief that people come to therapy for. When grief feels like it's been looping for months or even years without any relief. Okay. This is an inability to move forward. This is replaying the loss. And this is avoiding any and every kind of reminder. And culturally, we say things like, well, she just never got over it, or he never moved on. And sometimes it's because loss can be kind of shocking, that it's unresolved and our brain just can't file it away neatly. And I've touched this kind of grief in loss of loved ones and in breakups when months later, okay, I'm still scrolling on that social media. You know that's not good for you, right? Shameless plug. This episode isn't about healthy habits on social media. Maybe we'll do that in season 4. But exposing yourself to the thing that's hurting you, that's going to make it keep hurting you, that's a conversation for another day. Still imagining conversations that's going to build upon prolonged grief, right? Still replaying last words that's going to build upon prolonged grief. And sometimes that means you're not just missing the person. You end up being stuck in a loop of a life that you could have had, but you will not have because of the reality that comes with loss. A fourth type of grief is like a collective or community grief. This is a shared grief after events happen. What kind of event, Catherine? I'm so glad you asked. COVID-19, the pandemic, that was collective grief. We've seen it with things like school shootings and racial injustice. Everyone is kind of walking around heavy, and it's not always clear where the heaviness belongs, because it belongs to all of us. And that ache that you feel when you walk outside and everyone else feels it at the same time can be described as collective or community grief. And the fifth type is sacred or transformational grief. It sounds real therapeutic. This is when grief becomes a turning point, right? This sounds like Hannah, okay? Hannah's grief led to Samuel. David's grief led to deeper worship. And your grief could lead to empathy for people or even a purpose that you never imagined. Culturally, you hear people say, like, I wouldn't wish this loss on anybody, but I wouldn't be who I am without it. It doesn't make grief easier, but it definitely does make it meaningful. So for me, when I think about the grief of losing the girl I used to be before my healing journey became, that version of me had to die so I could live more freely. And at the time, it felt like a failure. But on the other side, it feels really, really holy. Like God kind of uses that grief as a soil for something new to grow. So what I hear in all of this is that grief isn't one size fits all. It's anticipatory and ambiguous and complicated and collective and messy and sad and sacred and holy and transformational. It's all of those things. And the thread that ties all of this together is it's not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of love. If you feel grief, that means your heart works because you love something. And it's a signal that we're made for so much more. So if you're grieving today, whether it's a person or a dream or a season, let your grief teach you something. Let it point you back to God, who once asked the very same question, where are you? Something terrible has happened. Not because he lost track of you, but simply because he missed you. Well, it's time for the segment that we all know and love the best. It's time to dig just a little bit deeper. The whole reason this episode is titled It Is Well is because of the hymn. Horatio Spafford wrote it after losing his four daughters at sea, and the words, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, and sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. It is well with my soul." Very poetic, but that's a hard thing to wrestle with. The song kind of teaches us that grief and peace are not opposites. Okay. They kind of live in the same house together. And I think that what we're really trying to get at in this conversation we're having today, what does it take? Like what does it mean to say this thing that I lost and this thing that really, really hurts and this thing that I know I'm never going to get back, I'm okay. Like it is well. It's in my soul, like not just in my mind, not just in my conversation, not when people are passing me by. You go to the grocery store, hey, how are ya? I'm doing good. But on the inside, I just finished crying. How do I say it is truly, truly well with my soul? For me, my biggest season of grief, I get lost in translation sometimes when I think about it because the loss of my grandmother in 2019 was pretty difficult. That whole lemon cake situation, that wasn't just an analogy. That's my true life. No one has made a lemon cake like her. And I have to get to a point where I can say it is well with my soul that no one ever will. But I also reconcile another kind of grief that relates to my identity and letting go an older version of myself, a girl who thought she needed certain things or certain people, who tied worth to performance and trying to prove that I'm enough. So I juggle both of these losses because losing identity feels like death. It feels like a loss. And it feels like a funeral no one ever would come to. But inside, there was a time in my life where I was mourning a version of me that it just didn't fit. And if you just started watching the Life Well podcast, like if this is your first time and you went back and you watched season 2 and you liked it, you went back and you watched season 1 and you like it, her new girl, okay? Nobody met her before that year. So recognizing that there is something on the other side of grieving, even something like identity loss, can open the door to feeling freer and feeling lighter and feeling closer to God. So when I hear the hymn, It Is Well, I don't just think about death and loss. I think about shifts. I think about private funerals and quiet grief during the becoming phase of an entrepreneur, the becoming phase of a wife, the becoming phase of a mother, the becoming phase of a widow, and the kind of peace that that song talks about as it's coupled with the same kind of grief. So when grief shows up in your life, it doesn't mean that your faith is necessarily failing. It might actually mean that your heart is so capable of loving that you can't tell the difference between before and after. And I love another part about this hymn. It doesn't deny grief. It doesn't say there are no sorrows. Now I could sing it, right? But that would cost a little bit of money. It says when sorrows like sea billows roll. Remember, we've got our stream, we've got our wall, we've got our ocean hitting the wall, billows rolling over, that kind of grief that just comes in waves is how people usually describe it. And yet, somehow by grace, we still have an anchor in our soul. So, as we close out this episode, this Digging Deeper segment, I want to leave you with a thought. You don't have to force yourself to say, it is well, with a fake smile, right? You don't have to force yourself to say, when people ask, how are things going since insert thing you lost here? You don't have to lie. Because some of the support that we read about in the Bible when people were grieving, some of the support that we know is healthy for us when we talk about grief in psychology and in therapy, it comes through the power of community. So I actually encourage you to tell the truth. Because I've said it in the last season, we do bad by ourselves. The title of that movie is correct. You can wrestle with your grief with your friends. You can wrestle with your grief with your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. You can wrestle with your grief in your journal. Shameless plug. We should be journaling. And you can wrestle while still asking God questions. Saying it is well is not about dismissing your grief. You're sad. I get it. I've been sad. I've been very sad. And I'm a therapist, okay? I say that all the time. I should know. All my therapist friends tell me no necessarily. Just because you study it doesn't mean that it exempts you from the experience. You can be sad about what you lost, but you can also live through that loss. It's not about declaring that grief wins. It is acknowledging the grief, but noting that it does not have the final word. If no one's told you this yet, it's okay. It's okay that it still hurts. It's okay that you still miss them. And it's okay if grief is still coming to you like waves, like sea billows rolling, honey. It is okay. Not only is it okay, but it is well. Because you don't have to carry your grief alone. You don't have to hide behind the ache of being strong or the weight of holding it all together. And you don't have to rush into being completely whole by yourself, but you can be carried into wholeness by your Lord and Savior, none other than Jesus Christ, because you must call him by his name. Grief doesn't mean that you're not well. It means that you're becoming something. So I have a little homework for you. If you're new to the Life Well podcast, we do homework because learning is essential, right? So number one, option. I'm giving you options this season. You could write a letter to your grief, not to the thing that you lost, but to the grief itself. Dear grief, I've been avoiding you because. Finish that out. It could just be a sentence. It could be a paragraph. You could write a novel if you'd like. Submit it for publishing. See how far that takes you. Let that letter say everything that your mouth has not been saying. Option number two, speak peace over yourself using the hymn. Find those lyrics. Look them up or play this episode again so you can hear it again. It is well. It is well with my soul. Even if you don't believe it yet, speak it as a seed and watch it grow. And number three, list what you're still longing for. Write down what you miss, who you miss, what you hope for, and let that list be as honest as possible and not shameful in any way, shape, or form. And the last thing, of course, is if this episode touched you, share it with someone who you think may be quietly grieving, someone who's grieving out loud and they need to know that they are seen and safe and loved. Text it to a friend who always looks like she has it all together, but maybe she's been moving a little bit different lately, or maybe send it to yourself. Save it, replay it when the wave hits again. And if you have been missing someone or some part of yourself, I pray that you find peace today. Not because grief just automatically disappears, but it is in that brokenheartedness that the Lord truly does draw near. So my prayer is that your ache may be met with comfort, and that your silence will be wrapped in grace, and that you will know that you are not less whole because you grieve, and you're not less strong because you still feel, and you're not less called because you're still healing, and you and me and everyone else around you is still absolutely becoming well. And as always, I hope that this episode found you well. And if not, I hope that you become well. And prayerfully, we all stay well. I'm Catherine, and this is the Life Well podcast.
I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you. I am proud of you because you have overcome so much, yet you have so much more to accomplish. Everything that you so desire will be yours, because why you chose to heal instead of harm. Everything that you even think according to his will come to pass just because of the healing mindset that you're moving forward into. And this will be your best year yet. Just continue to trust him, regardless of what it looks like, because he sees it all.